The Vampire Killer of Sacramento, Richard Chase. Welcome back to Ontario Cold Cases, historical true crime Tuesdays, where we dive deep into some of the most notorious, mysterious, and shocking true crime stories. I'm your host, Jay Nickel of Nickel Investigations, and today we'll be exploring one of the most chilling and disturbing cases in American history, the story of Richard Chase, also known as the Vampire Killer of Sacramento. Richard Chase was not your average serial killer. His horrifying acts, driven by delusions and mental illness, earned him the macabre nickname, the Vampire Killer. His obsession with blood, violence, and paranoia about his own body's decay pushed him over the edge, leaving a trail of horror in his wake. This episode contains details of extreme violence, so listener discretion is strongly advised. It's the late 1970s. Sacramento, California is about to be rocked by a wave of brutal killings that would forever scar the community. But to truly understand the terrifying spree of Richard Chase, we have to start at the beginning of his descent into madness. His early life. Born on May 23, 1950, Richard Trenton Chase was a child of an ordinary family. However, behind the scenes, his early life was far from stable. His parents fought constantly, and Richard suffered from abuse. As he grew older, he exhibited signs of a deeply disturbed individual. His behavior was marked by classic warning signs of future violence, cruelty to animals, starting fires, and an obsessive interest in blood. One of the most striking features of Chase's early life was his hypochondria. He was convinced that something was seriously wrong with his body. He believed his blood was turning to powder, that his heart was shrinking, and that his stomach was on the verge of collapsing. Doctors would later diagnose him with paranoid schizophrenia. These delusions grew darker over time. By his early 20s, Chase's fascination with blood had turned into an obsession. He would capture and kill small animals, drinking their blood, believing it was the only way to keep himself alive. This gruesome habit only worsened with time. His friends and family were aware of his bizarre behavior, but no one could predict the violent storm that was brewing inside him. Institutionalization and release. This episode is brought to you by Nickel Investigations. In 1976, after being found attempting to inject rabbit's blood into his veins, Chase was committed to a mental institution. During his time there, he earned the nickname Dracula from the staff because of his obsession with blood. He often talked about his need to consume blood to survive, claiming that Nazis were turning his blood into dust using poison. You might think this would be the place where his violent tendencies were addressed, but tragically that wasn't the case. Despite his disturbing behavior, Chase was released from the institution after doctors deemed him no longer a danger to himself or others. He was sent back into the world, unsupervised and untreated. The stage was now set for the horrors that would follow. The murders begin. On December 29, 1977, Chase committed his first known murder. His victim, 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, was simply unloading groceries outside his home when Chase shot him in a drive-by attack. It seemed like a random attack of violence, but for Chase it was only the beginning of something much darker. After this first murder, Chase's behavior spiraled even further out of control. His delusions worsened and his obsession with blood grew more intense. His apartment became a nightmare, covered in bloodstains from animals he had slaughtered and consumed. His neighbors were horrified by the smell and his unkempt appearance, but no one could have imagined the horrors he was planning. Then on January 23, 1978, Richard Chase escalated. He entered the home of Teresa Wallen, who was 3 months pregnant at the time, and murdered her in the most brutal way imaginable. He shot her 3 times, then mutilated her body in a way that shocked even seasoned investigators. Chase drank her blood and removed some of her organs, a grim echo of his belief that he needed blood to survive. Chase wasn't done. Just 4 days later, he entered the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Mroth. What followed was one of the most horrific crime scenes in modern American history. Chase brutally murdered Evelyn, her 6-year-old son Jason, her 22-month-old nephew David, and a visiting family friend. After killing them, he engaged in his ritual of mutilation, blood consumption, and necrophilia. The entire scene was a horrific testament to Chase's psychosis and lack of connection to reality. There was a stroke of luck. A neighbor knocked on the door during the crime, causing Chase to flee the scene before he could continue his horrific acts. The arrest. This episode is brought to you by Nickel Investigations. On January 27, 1978, just 2 days after the Mroth family massacre, police arrested Richard Chase. They found him walking in his neighborhood, wearing blood-stained clothing and carrying a box of bloody rags. When they searched his apartment, the true depth of his madness was revealed. The walls were covered in blood, and inside his refrigerator were the remains of animals and body parts from his victims. Chase had been collecting blood, storing it in various containers and consuming it to satisfy his gruesome cravings. The evidence was overwhelming, and Chase's trial began soon after. He was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death. However, even behind bars, Chase's deteriorating mental state continued. He'd later be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and many argued that his delusions had driven him to commit these unimaginable acts of violence. The death and legacy. December 26, 1980, Richard Chase was found dead in his prison cell. He committed suicide by overdosing on antidepressants that he had been stockpiling for weeks. So ended the life of a man whose madness had led to untold horrors. The case of Richard Chase is often held up as an example of the failure of the mental health system to protect society. Despite numerous signs that he was a danger to himself and others, Chase was released from treatment and allowed to continue his deadly downward spiral. The story serves as a haunting reminder of the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness. That concludes this episode of Ontario Cold Cases, Historical Crime Tuesdays. Richard Chase's reign of terror lasted only a few months. His crimes left an indelible scar in Sacramento. His case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we deal with mental illness, violence, and the fragile line between reality and delusion. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll explore another terrifying case from the annals of true crime. Until then, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, the world is often darker than we think. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Ontario Cold Cases and leave us a review. Follow us on social media for updates and behind-the-scenes contents. Thank you for listening.